and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. The program is coming to you live from Beijing. We start today's program with the latest on U.S. climate representative John Kerry. In fact, he's the special envoy of the U.S. president. His visit to China. Kerry has arrived in Shanghai to meet with his Chinese counterpart Xie Zhenhua. The visit comes ahead of a high-profile climate change summit initiated by Washington later in April. The White House said China is also invited to the summit. U.S. President Joe Biden is expected to outline the U.S. goal of carbon emission reductions by the year 2030, targets under the Paris Climate Agreement. Meanwhile, China has pledged to have carbon emissions peak by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. So, how big is the potential for China-U.S. cooperation on climate action? For John Kerry's visits to China on climate in Beijing, Zhou Ji, CEO and President of Energy Foundation China. Also in Beijing, Zhang Jianyu, Chief Representative of Environmental Defense Fund, Beijing. And also in D.C., Jennifer Turner, Director of the China Environment Forum from the Woodrow Wilson Center. Such a lovely occasion to see all of you once again. It's been a while that we haven't talked about the climate change. And now I'm so glad it's back onto the priorities. Ms. Turner, good to see you. We haven't talked to each other for 2 years. What do you make of the latest visit by Mr. Kerry, Secretary Kerry?
Well, I think it's quite exciting. It's clearly a reboot of the climate relationship that has been on, I guess, shall we say, on snooze for the past 4 years, since the past administration was not interested in working on climate. So, I mean, I think it's quite encouraging, even though we're maybe you're not going to see huge progress overnight, because again, we're restarting the relationship after 4 years.
I hear the birds chirping in the background where you're standing. So I'm so glad that you are back onto the program. Let me go to you, Jianyu. Haven't seen you for quite some time. What do you make of the potential of this visit?
Yeah, but I've been following you with WeChat all the time. So glad to see you again.
Good to see you.
Same here. Very excited. Icebreaker, and also I want to say that. Hopefully that the negotiation will not only lead to climate breakthroughs, but also is the beginning of a new era of U.S.-China relationship with regard to the bilateral.
Well, here's the thing, isn't it? That people say this could be the common ground. I mean, if this could not be, what will, right? Climate change is the challenge facing everyone. But on the other hand, there are real difficult issues between the two countries. When the environment has been soured and toxic, can the two, the special envoys from both sides be able to really work on the climate change issues? Mr. Zhou.
Yeah, I think the two groups, I mean, Secretary John Kerry and Mr. Xie, they have known for many years already, and I take it for granted. I mean, the two teams, as old friends or old colleagues, they talk about climate change over 10 years. But now the situation, the political environment seems to be totally different from 10 years ago, even 7 years ago. But I think it's still possible for the two sides to reach some agreement if they just take their common ground for the human interests, I mean global safe climate.
I see. Well, I think your answer has more hope than the real necessary content that we're likely to see, but I'm sure we're going to talk about that. Jianyu, tell me more about what are likely to be the areas to be touched on by the two sides. After all, they've already have several rounds of discussions between Mr. Xie and Mr. Kerry. So this time is much more public because Mr. Kerry is making a trip to China. So what are likely to be some of the concrete issues on the table?
Well, I think both sides have been making moves, actions, statements with regard to their own ambition on climate change. China, since President Xi made the groundbreaking announcement on September the 22nd for China to achieve early peaking by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060. President Biden has been making climate change as a center issue of his campaign, and he immediately returned to the Paris Agreement on January the 5th, and right after he came back to the White House, and also has been making that as also a centerpiece of his rebuilding plan for the United States. But both sides also facing challenges on a range of the issues. But I think it's really time, and I think they really have common grounds that they can touch upon. But because the bottom line is, I think both sides recognize climate change is an existential threat.
Right.
That really, if we want to find a solution for that, we need to work together.
Ms. Turner, the U.S. committed to 2030, China committed to 2030, the U.S. committed 2050, China committed to 2060. As the largest developed economies and emerging economies, certainly the two sides have real commitments. The next step is the roadmap and how they would correlate with one another, both in making a statement to the international community together and also in doing their own housework well. What do you see are some of the concrete issues on the table?
Well, I mean, in some ways, previous two speakers covered some of this, but I think that they are both going to be talking about, what their near-term, both countries are going to need to take faster action now to really be at the 2050 or 2060 goals. And I think that there could be the issue of, maybe also thinking about helping developing countries to lower their CO2 emissions. And I think with President Xi's, desire to green the Belt and Road Initiative, and President Obama talking about how foreign policy is climate policy, that you could really see some potential that, I don't know if it's direct collaboration, but coordination of helping to lower CO2 emissions in countries that are struggling right now to do that.
Cooperation in the third country or internationally together, that could be certainly a step forward. Let's take a look at details as to how much the two countries, China and the United States, are spending on clean energy.
Biden's $2.3 trillion infrastructure plan, if signed into law, would be one of America's largest federal efforts ever to stem its greenhouse gas emissions. The plan would see the U.S. invest $35 billion into clean technologies and spend $174 billion on overhauling the country's electric vehicles market. But that still pales in comparison to what China has spent on clean energy research and development in recent years. China's R&D spending climbed 10.3% to $378 billion in 2020, outpacing the U.S., according to China's National Bureau of Statistics.
Now, there are several issues that probably has to be defined well before the two envoy can really make strides forward. One is the issue about technology and security, Jianyu. National security has been used as a buzzword, especially by the United States, I think. So, well, there are different arguments from the other side, though, that it's too much of it, exaggerations of it, using it as a buzzword rather than know the real interpretation of it has harmed the relationship, and so will be in the environmental protection area. After all, many of the technologies could be dual. Tell me more about how is this likely to have an impact on the overall process?
Well, I think people have been making buzz with regard to transfer of the technologies, but I think we need to remember that technology transfer itself was built into as one of the core pillars for global climate cooperation.
Indeed.
Into all the climate agreements, including the most recent one, the Paris Agreement.
Yeah.
So the developed nations has an obligation to transfer the technologies to help the developing countries to take care of their existing situation so that they can move forward. If you look at what China has been doing with regard to the Belt and Road, the Green the Belt and Road Initiative, China has been one of the largest builders of the renewable technologies into the other developing countries. So I agree with the previous speaker that I think the two sides, instead of looking just at each other under the microscope, they should really try to touch on new ground to work together. And one of those areas is to work together in the third country and help to bring them. And technology transfer is could be one part of it.
Jennifer, keep on nodding her head. I saw it already. Jennifer, you want to come in on that?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think too that also when we think about technology, I want you to think beyond solar panels and wind turbines.
Right.
One area that was for many years, particularly in the Obama administration, fruitful, cooperation on energy efficient buildings. It still continues today between the U.S. and China about low cost, no cost options to make buildings more energy efficient. I mean, they're the big footprint of our energy and carbon in both countries. That kind of area should also be considered. I mean, managing demand, reducing demand, and as these developing countries are building their buildings, they wanted, like following China's path now. China is also working on making more energy efficient buildings, and so that's another kind of sector to look at. Just wanted to interject that because I think it's don't just think about wind turbines and solar panels.
I've been having really some time that I haven't heard much positive interactions between the Chinese and American side. I mean, both are friendly, very intellectual exchanges, but not necessarily, that one would build on the points of the other and have a real interaction of improvement of points. This is the very first time, shall I say, in quite some time over the past year that I have hosted a discussion like this, which means, I guess, once the real issue discussion starts, we could always find common ground. Well, who am I to say that? I guess, Xie, you are better in knowledge to say what is the nature of this likely discussion between the two envoys and likely the momentum they lead the two groups and the two countries to. Mr. Zhou.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
I want to point out that, my other two...
Okay, so I think now the two envoys, they met together to discuss real common interest issues, climate change, and also to front the way for the two sides to cooperate for multilateral issues and bilateral issues, including ambition, pathway, specific technology, finance, very broad issue there. But one thing they need to be very careful, to avoid some negative impact on their talk by some negative forces. They are not necessarily useful for the on-the-ground cooperation.
This is a great point. I was thinking just how the two gentlemen have to work, how hard they have to work, because this is not an issue that is purely about climate change. This is really climate change, but really about politics. And they have to report to their home turf, to their own constituencies, to the public opinions, to the politicians at home. This is a gigantic, I would say, a project that these two gentlemen shoulder. Jennifer.
Well, yes and no. Keep in mind that U.S.-China energy, climate, and clean energy cooperation is kind of built into the DNA of our relationship. Not just under the Obama administration, but there has been a lot of collaboration, and not just at the gov to gov level, but NGOs, foundations. We have the Energy Foundation here on the panel, universities. They have continued to cooperate and do work, and so I think, and that's been also a very important foundation when it comes to the bilateral relationship. Because again, talking about the the political level, but the boots on the ground, that has been happening with scientists, NGOs, researchers, foundations. So I think that I mean, again, I am a more glass half full kind of person, but I've been sitting and have a front row seat for 21 years here at the Wilson Center, and I've seen this as it has really been, think of it as science or climate or environmental diplomacy, that when the relationship is going up and down, which it always does and it always will between our two countries, but climate and energy relationships conversations have just continued. So I think it actually has more of a stabilizing effect.
Mr. Zhang.
Potential.
Well, I couldn't agree with that more. Really, myself is really blessed by U.S.-China environmental collaboration dated back to 20 years ago, when then Premier Zhongji traveled to the United States and signed the first U.S.-China bilateral dedicated environmental collaboration. But Tianwei, for your point, I also want to say that Eisenhower used to say, if you really want to solve a problem, make it bigger. So maybe right now is the opportunity, for the two countries to recognize the common ground through solving the climate crisis, which is an existential threat. Then we open the new doors and avenues for other areas of collaboration.
Yeah, another issue is about the timetable. China has already committed to 2060 when going carbon neutrality. That is a huge commitment because one has to recognize it's only 30 years after carbon zero that China goes there. Of course, for the other developed economies, it's 2050. Well, it's understandable as the industrial age of the developed economies have been going through for decades, if not longer. So, but there is debate about that, about the timetable. How important it is, Mr. Zhou, that we are not blocked, by empty debates like this, but rather focusing on the real issues every step of the way, the roadmap, the implementation, the mutual checks on each other, and also mutual support on each other, Mr. Zhou.
Yeah, sure. In fact, that's a matter of how to design the time frame. Over 30 to 40 years. So from the perspective of history, the time given to China is much shorter than the one to developed countries in the history. Normally, developed countries spend over 40, even 50 years to reach neutrality after peaking. And while China only have around 30 years. And that's a matter of innovative development pathway. So that means we need to find some way ahead, totally different from the one developed countries experienced. And then we need to design the milestone over time, and also to see what technology, or technological roadmap should apply to, and then how to invest in those technologies, how to finance them, and what policies and the institutional arrangement should be made. So this is a long-term design, but starting from now.
Mr. Zhang, I understand that China has already begun this process, trying to come up with the specific roadmaps and specific marks to be met and implemented. What is the latest process so far?
Well, my understanding is that after the groundbreaking announcement on September the 22nd, not only President Xi has been making statements worldwide, by our account 7 occasions, but there have been 3 important really milestones in the domestic policy making. One is December the 18th last year, the Central Committee's economic planning meeting. Then in March, in the 14th five-year plan, that the early peaking plan was highlighted, and then it was re-emphasized again in the party's economic meeting on March the 15th. So I think a really significant effort has gone into the making of this early making plan, not only at the national level, but start to get distilled into the provincial and also at the sectorial levels.
Right.
I think we have every confidence that a master plan, a detailed implementation plan will be rolled out soon to guide China from now on to 2030 to achieve this early peaking.
We have 1.5 minutes left for Jennifer. Tell me more about your assessment of China's latest development. And what about the U.S.? Do you have a specific plan? Do you have specific marks that the others could also check whether U.S. has been doing its job?
Well, I think that, we have transparency here on what and measuring on what our CO2 emissions have been. And I think that next week when the Biden-Harris administration announce what our goals are going to be, for the roadmap, I think that is going to be announced next week. But I want to interject something a little different here, that just because you've been talking about the formal talks, but let's talk about when Xi Jinping, when he made the announcement last year that China is going to move away from internal combustion engines and really promote electric vehicles. And you've seen them on Chinese streets. That was a global game changer, right? All around the world now, the automobile industries are pivoting. You're seeing countries investing in it. And so I just wanted to kind of interject that while we have these formal climate talks, there's actions that in this case China and the U.S. as well, that when our two countries, when each of them make decisions like this, it has kind of, shall we say, positive ripple effects, and and maybe starting off kind of like a race to the top on clean electric vehicles. So I just wanted to add that in here.
Of course, there is very important balance to be kept. One is about the green development. The other is we don't want to greenwash either. But how to keep that balance, that's a very important question. Another thing is geopolitics and also different approaches to green development. Well, the U.S. is having on April the 22nd and 23rd a global climate change conference. China, Germany, and France are also going to have their own conferences before that later this week. We're going to see all the latest and exciting developments, certainly from different perspectives. Thank you so much, the three of you. It's finally to see you again. Zhang Jianyu, Jennifer Turner, Zhou Xie, good to see you. Have a great evening and have a great day. Thank you.